Greetings, this is Mistress Gabrielle Dauvergne of the Pennsic Storytelling Academy. Basics of Storytelling, Part 2. In case you missed Part 1, I'll just quickly review that I talked about my triad of storytelling, which is just an order in which you should place your priorities when telling stories. The first thing that is important, and the most important thing, is your audience. The material that you're working with is second, and you need to be true to the culture of the story, true to the story, and do your homework, do your research. And lastly, you. Although there is a culture of the bardic bombasticness, is that a word? I don't know. But your ego will turn off more people than if you make mistakes in your story. So just think about where you belong in the hierarchy of that performance. Lastly, we talked about the tools of the storyteller: eye contact, facial expression, body language, voice intonation. And that's what we'll be talking about in more detail in this session, along with getting over your nerves of working with an audience and some of the things to consider when you are setting up a storytelling situation, event, what have you. So the first thing I'd like to do is encourage you to tell stories. A lot of times the thing that makes new bards the most nervous is that idea of just being in front of an audience. There is that stage fright that it's called. Well, a couple of things that I tell my students that may help you is that, first of all, if you have made your audience the most important thing and the story the most important thing, you disappear when you are performing. So your ego isn't there, and people are not critical of you personally. They may be critical of your presentation and the story, but you know that, and that's where our nerves come in. We want them to like what we have to offer. We don't want them to belittle us. But here's the thing. The story that you are telling, or the song you're singing, or whatever you happen to be presenting as a bard, is a gift. You are giving them a gift. Now, of course, we want anyone we give a gift to, we want them to love the gift that we're giving them. But if you give them their very best, I guarantee, your very best, I guarantee you they are going to appreciate it. The audience isn't sitting there saying, I want this bard to really be bad. I want them to fail. I want them to fall flat on their face. No, they are interested in receiving the gift that you have to give them. And you can't go wrong with that. If you do that, it will help settle your nerves. And then use that nervous energy as part of your presentation. So now let's talk about the tools in more depth, the tools of a storyteller. And I'd like to start with eye contact. You can make a whole lot of mistakes as a storyteller if you learn some of the little tricks to keep going. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But if you don't look at your audience, you are going to lose them right up front. You need eye contact. Imagine if I were doing this class with you right now, looking at the ceiling because I'm afraid of that eye contact, you know, or looking at the floor and talking to you. I'm sure it wouldn't be all that engaging. So looking at your audience is really, really important. Why don't we do that? Because the eyes are the windows of the soul. You look at somebody, they look back at you, you are connected. There may be a fear that we have of that connection. You need to get past it. You need to look at your audience. Now, I'll just give you a little bit of feedback or a little bit of information about when I stand on the stage, what I do. And I learned this from other storytellers who learned it from other storytellers. Mundanely, I am a storyteller as well as in the SCA. Well, they get up on the stage, and before they even open their mouths, they take a breath, and they look around the space. They engage the audience, a person at a time. Granted, they may not look at every single person. They look at the back of the room. Just drink in the environment with your eyes before you even open your mouth. If nothing else, it gives the illusion that you have looked at each and every person. And you don't just stare at one person. As you are telling your story, you're looking around the space. People will say later, oh, she was telling that story just to me, or he was telling that story just to me. He looked right at me. When in fact, you might have been looking right over that person's head at the back of the room, but there is that illusion. Now, do you have to have eye contact to tell a story? In truth, not really, but you do have to give the illusion that it was there. And here's why I say that. In our Mundane Storytelling Guild, I'm from the Ridrick Hale, which is Buffalo, New York, and Western New York. We have a storyteller mundanely who's blind. He's been blind almost since birth. But when he stands up to tell a story, his presence is so engaging that even though you know he can't see, and even though his eyes are closed, you sense his presence. You feel like he is looking at you. And that takes some work to accomplish if you are already sighted. But you can do it. So eye contact is very important. It's one of the things that I learned as a teacher, so I got my master's in education. And one of the things about working your classroom or managing your classroom, it's just like managing an audience, was that if somebody isn't paying attention, you can bore a hole right through them by looking at them. And then when they catch your eye contact, they will pay attention. So it's a little trick of the trade, if you will, but it belongs in your regular toolbox as a storyteller. The other thing is facial expression. People always tell me I don't smile enough, and I'm trying to learn how to smile more, especially with this new medium of using a camera to talk to people, because you don't catch all of the smileful moments in between what I have to say. But I am very introspective, so sometimes there's just a lot going on up here and not a lot coming out here. But when I'm telling a story and engaging with an audience, there are facial expressions. Now, and I'm going to talk about body language too, but I want to, in both facial expression and body language, use of hands, whatever, I want to point out that cultures are different too. So Irish storytellers, mundanely, I've seen them, and some of them, many of them, don't move. They sit. Right now, I'm sitting here. You can't see all of me, but I'm sitting here with my hands folded in my lap. And that's how a lot of them will tell a story, and there won't be a whole lot going on here. But what's important is that whatever is happening with your face matches what you're doing with your story. So there's a little activity that I do when I could do this live. It's very hard right now to do past the face, but if I go within context of my story, I think you get the idea that that character is happy. But if I'm You know that character's not very happy. And it's a little bit creepy. So your facial expression has to go along with what you're doing in the story, what the characters are doing, what they're saying. That comes naturally for some people. Now, I said the Irish storytellers will just tell you a story, and there's not a whole lot going on with their face or their body that necessarily has anything to do with the story, but it matches in that there's nothing going on. For instance, this little exercise, for instance. I'm going to say my dog died. The words, my dog died. My dog died. My dog died. My dog died. 3 different ways of saying the same words, and each one had a completely different meaning between the lines, if you will. But I want you to also notice that it's almost impossible for the intonation and the way the words are said not to match the face. So if I went, my dog died, it still has a sad feel to it. My dog died. You really can't. You can't make it sad when you're smiling. Just try that. Just try that for yourselves sometimes. Stand in front of a mirror, make faces, and say the words and see what happens. So there's also a tilt of the head, so the body language. Happy, I'm out here, I'm open, I'm joyful, sad, I'm closed in. You can't see it, but my hands are folded, my arms are folded, my shoulders are hunched. I'm inward. So the body follows the voice, follows the intonation, and that brings it all together into a believable character in your story. How is storytelling different from acting? Because it is. It is very different. And I can tell, and there's nothing wrong with this, don't get me wrong, but I can tell when a storyteller has come from an acting background. It's a whole different experience than somebody who has just popped in as an oral storyteller. In acting, there is a 4th wall. It's an invisible wall. The audience is on the other side of that wall. The only exception to that would be the type of plays. Shakespeare is a good example where there's an aside where the actor actually speaks to the audience for a moment and lets them in on a secret, brings them past that 4th wall onto the stage. But for the most part, when you are viewing a play, and that's what you are doing, you are viewing the story. The actor interacts with the other actors, interacts with the script, interacts with the stage setting, but doesn't really interact with the audience. It's okay, if you are acting, to turn your face aside and talk to another actor, forgetting that the audience is there. And for the most part, an actor is playing one role. As the storyteller, you are playing all the roles in the story, including the narrator and the ringmaster, if you will, where you are maintaining control over the setting. And that 4th wall vanishes. The 4th wall vanishes. So you're no longer your audience is no longer viewing the story taking place in front of them, but they are part of the story. And the best storytellers I know, now material will make a difference too. So we'll come back and talk about that, how the material will make a difference in how you interact with the audience. But the best storytellers I know, they talk to the audience before, after, and sometimes during the story that they're telling. They educate the audience as they're going along. So if I said to you the word in a story, if somebody likened their sweetheart to, "Oh, aren't you a snickerdoodle?" I might stop and say, "Snickerdoodle is a really delicious cookie. So sweet and so nice. No wonder he called his sweetheart a snickerdoodle." That's acceptable in storytelling. The fourth wall is gone. I've interacted directly with the audience. I have come out of character and I have become the stage master, the ring master, if you will, the narrator. In the story, you have to be all the women, you have to be all the men, you have to be all the animals, you have to be sometimes the inanimate toaster, and you have to be the storyteller narrator. Now, of course, I mentioned that's different with different kinds of stories, so let's talk about that now. I have a couple of stories that I tell that are monologues, and I'm in character in a different time period. And because I'm in a different time period, and I'm in the story, I do not come out of character to talk to the audience. It's still a story, but it's bordering very close on theater instead of storytelling. One is The Move-In Dress, which is a story about the Dust Bowl, the American Dust Bowl. Although there are a couple of places where I do engage the audience, or I have started doing that, as if they are there in that time period with me. And that works. That works. Another is the story of Joan of Arc. And I also tell a story about an Irish saint. But in that case, I'm telling it in character as a Cistercian nun from the 12th century. And I can engage my audience as the nun. But once I'm into the story, if I am one of the characters in the story, I cannot come out and address the audience. So that's really what I'm referring to, is if you are in the story, you are a character. You have to judge whether it's appropriate for that character to step out of character and engage the audience. Some very sweet stories. It might be best just to keep the audience in the story. But then there are interactive stories where you want to teach them how to participate in the story and do repetitive parts with you, maybe hand motions, sounds, and what have you. So there's all different kinds of stories, and within that context, different ways that you interact with the audience. But the most important thing is to realize that in storytelling, that fourth wall is gone. So body language, we talked about body language, we talked about facial expression, eye contact. One thing I want to mention about body language is to be very careful how you decide to move. Now, when I am working on a story, I never give any thought to what I'm going to do with my face in this part of the story. It's not scripted like that. What am I going to do with my body in this part of the story? What am I going to do with a character voice? So sometimes character voices are a really good thing to do. and other times they can be distracting. And in some cases, I tell the entire story in a character voice as the narrator. So what do I mean by that? Well, I have a Civil War story where I'm an Irish woman, and so I tell that story with a bit of an Irish accent. My Dust Bowl story, my character has a Southern accent, and so on. You have to know not to step out of that by accident and slip into your regular voice. That's the hard part. But what I was saying is I don't script my body language and my character voices and all of that. It comes naturally, and when it does, I say, "Ha, that's the way I want to do it." Now let me give you an exception. For example, there's a story that I tell about Wolf and Crane. It's an Aesop's fable. And I may tell it later, or I may tell it in the program that I'm doing. But it's a story about Wolf teaching Crane not to be such a braggart. And it's only like a couple of lines, a couple of paragraphs in the book, but I've expanded it and I've added other characters. And each of those characters has their voice. The birds, they're just sort of like, "Oh, Crane, oh, Crane." And the squirrel, "Oh, Crane, oh, Crane, oh, Crane, oh, Crane, won't you go, won't you go, won't you go get that nut for me, won't you go, huh?" See, he's very excitable. And Wolf has a deep voice. And then there's Crane. Crane is a beautiful bird. I just know I'm so beautiful. Well, she has kind of a little Southern accent. And I didn't plan for her to have it, but she just does. She's just a Southern belle and so beautiful. Well, if I tell that story in the SCA, I try to change up the voice so that Crane doesn't have such a Southern accent. Because I am not from the South, and I am not a Southern character. But if it's your natural voice, what are you going to do? You're going to have a Southern accent. So it's just a matter of thinking a little bit about whether or not the voice is appropriate in your story. But I don't really script it. It just sort of happens. It just sort of happens for me. As I mentioned before, the Irish storytellers, they use very little facial expression or body language, and they also use very little in the way of character voices. Pretty straightforward. But if you are using characters that are talking and interacting with each other, the most important thing to remember is to keep them straight. I know someone who tells a story like this and then turns like this to be the other character. That can be very distracting. And we were talking about what led to all of this was using your body appropriately when you are telling a story. So constantly turning away from the audience to have the characters talk to each other is pretty much unnecessary. There are ways where you can do it like this and like this without a whole lot of movement. I do know storytellers who pace constantly back and forth across the stage. For me personally, it's distracting. It takes me out of the story instead of bringing me into it, because that's their movement, not the character's movement. Now, if it's the character's movement, that's different. If the character is doing this kind of thing, that's fine. But if you're doing this while you are telling me a story, and this has nothing to do with the story that you're telling, that's the problem. So whatever you are doing with your face, with your intonation, with your character voices, with your body language, it should have to do with the story. That is really, really important. And this is all about crafting your art. But you're not ready for that if this is your first time telling a story. What you need to keep in mind is choose a story that you like, Tell it to an audience that is appropriate for that story, in a setting that is appropriate for that story. So we talked about that in part 1, which stories to tell when, and when to tell a story, and when to walk away. So that's important. And don't worry about whether or not your audience is going to like you. Give them the gift. Put your all into making sure they like the gift you have to give them. That's the most important thing. All the rest, what you do with your body, what you do with your face, what you do with your language, all of that will come after you have told the story over and over and over again. Now, if you only have one story to tell it as much as you can. Tell it to your friends, tell it to the kids in your camp, tell it to your husband, tell it to your cat, tell it to your dog, tell it to yourself in the mirror before you take it to a big audience. Tell it, tell it, tell it. That story is like a new pair of shoes you just bought at the store. When you put your feet in them, they're going to be a little pinchy. After you tell it a long time, it's going to be like those slouchy old shoes that are falling apart, but they fit your feet so comfortably. As soon as you get home, you kick off those new high heels and you put on those cozy, cozy slippers. That's what you want your stories to become, your cozy, cozy slippers. Now, as long as we're on that topic, I will mention one more thing in the basics part 2. And that is, try to get yourself 4 to 5 stories that you can tell in various places. And, your first story, that's going to be your strongest, because that's going to be the one you've told over and over and over again. Your second story that comes along, that's not going to be as strong as the first story because you haven't told it as long. It's a newer story. So what would you do? If you have a chance to tell 2 stories, you'd put your strongest story first. And it's okay to say to the audience, the second story I'm going to tell you is kind of new for me. I hope you don't mind if I let you hear it for the first time or the second time. Then you're going to learn your third story, and guess what? Your first story is going to be strong. Your second story is going to be almost as strong. Your third story is the new one, and here's what I want you to do with that one. I want you to put it in between your 2 strongest stories. You're going to start with your strongest one. You're going to put your third story in the middle. That's your newest one, and it's okay to tell the audience this is kind of a new story. And then you're going to sandwich it between another strong story for your finish. And which story do you tell first if you're doing a whole set? Well, mundanely, and I'll give her credit, her name is Elizabeth Ellis. She's one of the world's greatest storytellers. She lives in Texas. She does a lot of workshops, and she has taught a lot of people how to become storytellers. I was not one of her students, but I pay attention. And so this is what her suggestion is for building a set of stories. Ha-ha, aha, ah, and amen. The aha and the ah, they could be switched around, but you start with your funny ha-ha story. Start with something funny. Grab the audience, get their attention. And end with an amen story, the one where people walk away thinking about what you had to say and the lesson that you had to teach, and leave them wanting more. The ah and the aha, those are in between. I do want to mention one last thing in the basics, I think, that goes along with that whole idea of how to set up your stories. But has to do with one story, with whatever your one story is. One of the things that, one of the biggest problems that storytellers have, remember I said leave them wanting more? One of the biggest problems storytellers have is not wanting to shut up. Again, keep the audience as your number one focus. Make them the most important. They've heard you. Now give it a rest. Leave them with that moment in your story. And for goodness sake, know when to get out of a story. So let's suppose that you're writing a story. Now, this is also true if you are crafting a story that you haven't told before. Think of it, and I don't have a visual aid, but think of it like a roller coaster. There's that gradual, you're in the roller coaster car, you're excited to be going on this ride, you don't know what to expect at the other end, but you know it's going to be exhilarating. See, your audience thinks that about the story. And chug, 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 it slowly begins to go up the hill. Chug, chug. Now with a roller coaster, it needs that hill to give it the momentum, right? With your story, it needs that hill for you to build the suspense. This is where you introduce the characters. This is where you introduce the plot. You introduce the problem that the character has to face. Then they get up to the top of that roller coaster, which looks like this. Quite a steep hill. Get up to the top of that roller coaster ride. And if you're on a real roller coaster, that's when you look down the other side and go, oh my God! In a story, it's where your character goes, aha! I have the answer. I have the key. I found what I needed. I'm almost ready to complete this quest. Then, when you get up there, this is the problem a lot of storytellers have. They keep going and going and going and going. It's not the way a roller coaster ride works, is it? All the time is spent here going up, chug, chug, chug. All the time is spent going up. And then when you come down the other side, whoosh! And it's almost over before you know it. And then you're like, oh, I want to go again. Is it over already? Or you lose your lunch. But that's what you want to do with the story. Once that character has that aha moment, that climax of your story, now you want to wrap up all the details and get them out in a hurry. Solve it, get it done. If it's an epic story, like there's a story that I tell called The Battle of the Birds. It's actually 4 short stories put together. You get out of that story, and then another hill starts, and that's different. But if you are telling a 5, 10, even 15-minute story, once you reach that top part, you want to get out quickly. You want the audience to be happy and wanting more, not dreading that they ever allowed you to open your mouth. But that's all about putting the audience first, right? It is. So, thank you very much for attending the Pennsic Storytelling Academy Virtual Edition, Basics of Storytelling Part 2. If you didn't see Part 1, you might want to go back and look at that. I'm Mistress Gabrielle Dauvergne, and I'm very happy to teach you.